Hello, welcome to the Big Strategy Podcast. I'm your host and fellow strategist, Jeff Hyatt. This is your go-to spot for real talk with the masterminds of business strategy. It's about sharing stories, insights, and those little nuggets of wisdom to help you unlock big growth. Let's turn the key and spring into action.
Hi, my name is Beth Hammond. I've spent my career as an innovation leader in the food industry. I specialize in identifying, developing, and implementing new ideas, products, and processes to improve the food industry.
Beth, you talk about in the large company, 3 functions of innovation: get new customers, move into new verticals, and explore new businesses. That sounds like a great framework. How would you explain that framework?
Yes, well, there's a McKinsey model that a lot of large CPG companies use called the Horizon model, and they talk about horizons 1, 2, and 3. McKinsey, for a successful innovation at a company, should have work streams in all 3 horizons. 80% of your resources and time should be in Horizon 1 and 20% in Horizon 2 and 3. Horizon 1 is your typical line extension work where you're working with existing manufacturing processes, existing consumer base. In my experience in food, really like flavor line extensions. Horizon 2 would mean getting into a new vertical, but in the same space. So if you're in the grocery category and you're in bakery, maybe you're getting into dairy. That would be Horizon 2. Horizon 3 is a completely new business model. An example of that would mean a company developed proprietary software to help them with their existing business capabilities, but then they find that that software is something that they could license out to other companies to help them. That would be a completely new business model, and that's considered Horizon 3.
It's interesting you say that. When we talk about it in terms of COE, so I call it core innovation, is what you would call tier 1. Yeah. That's just creating efficiencies in what we already do. Mm-hmm. Organic would be that linear extension into the next level. And then E exponential is, like you said, when you move into that completely new business model. And in my experience, line extensions are easy for people to see because the ground's not moving. It's not radical innovation, right? If they can make that connection. So you talked about tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. Let's talk about your experience in the grocery space, CPG. Talk about tier 1 for us.
Yeah, tier 1 is really to defend your space. It's typically the existing product line that has this most significant market share for your brand. You will add line extensions for a few reasons. 1 is to bring in a new occasion. 2 would be to bring in a new consumer. And when you bring in a new occasion, you are increasing your buy rate, which means you want to increase the basket ring, but also the purchase frequency that you have a consumer come into the store. Another reason would be to replace it with a more accretive or better profit margins than you would have on a existing SKU, or maybe there's a SKU that is losing interest, sales, what have you, because trends have changed. And you want to replace that with something that is going to be more profitable.
So I think that's great. The new occasion is a really cool way to go about this. And you broke it down in terms of increasing the frequency of the buy rate, replacing something with a better profit margin or something that might be losing interest. Those are all great. What's an example of just a product that the average listener would understand that maybe is an example of one of these 3 changes?
One example, let's go in the dairy category. All right. For a long time, you just had full fat, regular milk, say, right? Then a new trend came and you get into 1%, 2% milk. A trend that a lot of people have seen recently is that getting dairy-free options. So you're seeing getting into almond milk. You saw soy milk for a while. Let's use the soy milk example. That was very popular and the first move away from dairy. That was the first, if you will, line extension or different type of extension off of dairy. Then there came a lot of information out there that soy is not really good for you. So it wasn't the idea that an alternative milk that wasn't good. It was the soy as the alternative milk ingredient that wasn't good, which is why you see more explore now into almond. Then you get a little backlash on almond because it takes a lot of water to create all of the almonds out there. So then that became a backlash because of sustainability. Then you move into oat milk. So now you see oat milk. If anybody goes into their typical Starbucks, they will have oat milk on the menu. And so that's how you see line extensions moving forward, replacing it with a better trend, but also something that could also be perhaps more accretive because almonds are very expensive. Oat is not. So it had a double play there in terms of profitability, but also increased consumer interest.
Perfect. I think that's an excellent example. My next question was going to be oat milk. Like, was that because it's sustainable or more profitable? And every time I go to the coffee shop, they want to charge you 50 cents or $1 for oat milk, right? And they're making more money. That's really cool. I think that's a perfect example. And then the second piece of tier one you talked about was adding a line extension to attract new customers. So when we're using the soy, almond, oat example, did that bring in new customers, or were there other types of innovation that were necessary to think about that space and new customers?
That's really interesting. When you're looking at these new line extensions, I've typically done research where you look at the power to replace. And what you're trying to understand, is it going to cannibalize your current sales, or is it accretive and bringing in new customers? So some of that can be determined by doing primary research and figuring that out. You can also look at secondary research. For instance, there is, if you look at Hartman trends, there is dairy-free products across the board in a lot of different categories, not just in the pure dairy fluid milk category, are increasing in popularity. We're finding that a lot of more people are lactose intolerant. If you look at generalize the Asian population, they are very lactose intolerant, and there hadn't been a lot of research about what other alternatives they were doing. You could also go, though, and look in Asia and figure out what is going on. A lot of trends come from different parts of the world where you're seeing a lot of different cultures that either from a cultural standpoint or even from a biological standpoint have not been popular over time because of adversities or resistances or intolerances to certain ones.
That's perfect. You bring up two things that I really love to touch on. And the first is the balance between primary and secondary research. I'm defining them as, and you define them your way, but primary research, interviews, secondary research, maybe something from a database or online. Is that how, can you define primary and secondary as you see them? And like, how do you balance them, not just primary, secondary, but quantitative, qualitative?
Great point. A lot of questions around that. Primary research, the way I define it, is research that one or a company conducts on their own. It is a research study that has not been developed before. It doesn't exist out there. Secondary research is research, as you were saying, already exists out there. It could be through a publication. It could be used through, in the grocery channel, we use scan data through Circana or Nielsen. Those are secondary sources. You've probably heard of Mintel before. Those are secondary resources. Now, somebody made those primary at one point in time, but they exist out there, and to you, they are secondary resources. So to answer your part B of that question, what I typically do is when I start out a project, I do look at all the secondary sources out there. Primary research can be very expensive for a company. Doesn't matter if you're a startup or a large CPG, it's not cheap. And so when you're trying to frame up your problem to solve, you do want to exhaust all your secondary resources that you have out there first. Then if your answers are still not there, or you find that there are custom things specific to your brand or your product or your category that you need to answer, that's when you engage in primary research. And those can be anything from concept testing to conjoint studies to PGT tests to CLT, which is central location testing, numerous ones, but there's an opportunity to go there.
Let me ask then, when you're doing this research, like, how do you balance that? Because the secondary research exists, and in theory, your customers can get it. But then the primary research, as you said, is more expensive, but that's where the an insight may lie. And so with that, like, do you have just a fun story you could tell us about a time where you were doing research or kind of had an aha from your work?
It's a really good question. One thing I'll just tangentially say is now with AI too, there is everybody has access to it. So it's not only can I find the secondary research, it's a lot more accessible, and everybody else out there is hearing the same thing. I think what I have found is that if you're truly looking at innovation and you're truly trying to find a need that is unmet out there, even if the unmet need is ubiquitous, or general to, let's say, my competitors, this is when you get back to strategy, that the circumstances that my company is in terms of the brand we own and the equity that we have and our business model, our distribution footprint is likely going to be different than our competitor. So that is where what makes sense from an innovation standpoint for my company might not make one for another company. A long time ago, I worked for a larger company, and we started out by looking at leakage. Leakage means when everybody has something called a share of wallet. So when you go to a grocery store, you have, let's say, $20, $100 a month to go use for your groceries. There are many different outlets in which you could go. It could be a larger grocery store. It could be a farmer's market. It could be Costco. It could be a lot of different things. And so when you're talking about leakage as a retailer, it means somebody's share of wallet is going to some other outlet or another retailer, and you want them to come back to your retailer. So I was working for a larger retailer, and we found that we had a huge leakage gap to another large retailer with millennial women. And so a lot of the research I was able to do was looking at functional benefits. Now you see them all over the place. You see them for heart health or calming or digestive health. This was way back when this wasn't actually prevalent out there. And one way that I came up with this idea of getting into it, and it sounds typical now, but I did a whole lot of secondary research. I pulled every single aspect that I could. I looked to SPINS a lot, which looks at a lot more of the certifications and different elements that are on it. I looked to the natural channel a lot because that is where a lot of the smaller, not niche, but sort of beginning at the adoption curve, that is where you're going to find those products. I also looked at other industries. So I walked into a Bath and Body Works, and you saw perfumes and stuff that were for calming, or body lotions for calming. And you look at analog industries and come up with that.
One thing that you said earlier, and I want to tie back into where we're at in the conversation now, you talked about, using my words, designing at the extreme. And you've talked about, finding those people who are early on the adoption curve, or looking at analogous industries. Yeah, there you go. So for someone who is an innovator within their company, they're tasked with this Horizon 1, or what we might call this core innovation. Mm-hmm. Tell us more about this idea of, where do good ideas come from? I get this question all the time. Where do good ideas come from? And you've talked about a few of them. You mind sharing a little bit of your secret?
You have to be a good listener. You really have to be a good listener. Good ideas can come from anywhere. And I think a good innovator is always keeping their eyes, ears, and mind open wherever they are. We are all consumers. We all have phones, and we all go out to eat. And so I think one miss is that people a lot of the time think that the ideas need to come through all the specific research. And I know I've talked about that a lot. But in all honesty, I walked into a Bath and Body Works, and that is how I was like, oh, light bulb. You need to be open to culture. You need to be reading world news. You need to be reading celebrity magazines. You need to be on TikTok. I'm not saying it's right for everybody to promote on TikTok, but you need to be open to all those areas. One line extension that is pretty popular now is getting into spice. Okay. The reason that I say that, so if you look at the chip category, or you look at a lot of different categories, we are becoming a much more global society. A lot of global nations actually have spice, and they use that a lot in their food. That is coming back, and people are shushing up their food with a lot of global flavors and a lot of spice. That is an easy line extension for a lot of food categories. And that is accretive, maybe not bringing in a new consumer. It might, but it certainly might be increasing the occasion for the existing brand.
That's perfect. And I think you touch on another point I want to unpack a little bit is I always get questions about the role of diversity in innovation. And sometimes it sounds like a pithy answer, but I wholeheartedly believe that you have to be open to everything. Like you cannot be a successful innovator and discriminate, but beyond just not discriminating, it needs to be inclusive. You talked about you've brought up multiple times this idea of embracing other cultures. And so I describe it as what I call the traveler's mindset. You just go out and everything's different. If you look at it through different sets of eyes, what's your opinion on how we can use a more diverse perspective or bring in diverse voices to improve innovation?
I mean, representation in this case is really important. I think there's a lot of books out in the tech industry of how certain things were developed and they did not have diversity in mind. One quick tangent, you'll notice that all the crash tests that were done on cars were for males and not females and made for the male sized body. And therefore, females, I think the statistic is less likely to get in a crash, but if they're in a crash, they are 15% more likely to get injured because the innovation was not done on a diversity of people. That's just one example of why you need to bring in different points of view, because I think a traveler's mindset is great, but you have also been shaped, or one has also been shaped by all of their experiences and throughout in education and jobs and things like that. It's really important to bring in people for a diverse point of view anytime you are looking at innovation, because there's a lot of things you've probably have missed.
That's 100% right. And we've talked about this before, and I know you feel passionate about this. Many innovation leaders are white men. And as a woman, when you walk into these rooms or these situations, just for anyone listening who may be facing that challenge, what advice do you have for anyone who's not the white male in a room of innovators to?
Yeah, it's a loaded question, but it's an important one. You have to have conviction. You have to, I mean, innovation's not easy. You have to want to do it. It has to be, I mean, we had talked about too, like innovation's usually the first to go in a company because it's not part of the core business stream. You have to love doing it. I would say, again, you want to align self-interest. So you don't want to go into a situation where you're being combative with senior leadership. That is a losing proposition for you to begin with. But I think I've mentioned before, there are three key things that I think one needs in innovation. We've talked a lot about the unmet consumer need and identifying that. To me, that is actually the third most important thing that you need in innovation. You need it. It's the base of what you're doing, but it's the third most important. The second one would be the go-to-market strategy. That's how you go to market. How do you support it? What is the price point? Where do you launch it? The number one thing to me in all of the industries and all the companies I've worked for is the executive level support. And I'm not talking about innovation theater where they're looking at, I just want the bright, shiny object. I am talking about true innovation support where they believe. They don't have to understand it, but they have to support you and believe that you are on the right path. And while your process may not look the same as it does in other functions in the company, that this is what it takes to make something work. And the only places I've been where true innovation, in my opinion, has been successful is where I've had that kind of support.
So let me follow up. What's more important, the innovator or the idea?
I think the innovator. There are lots of great ideas out there that have never made it to market. And that doesn't mean that they're not great ideas. There are really some great ideas, but it's not if you build it, they will come. You have to have the support along the way, the feasibility, the viability, but really the executive level support into make it work. And so to getting back to your original question, you do need to align self-interest. It will never work for you internally in a company if you are going against executive leadership. But I would also say before engaging in innovation at a large company, really look at your leaders of the company. Do they have the history, either at this company or other companies, to really support innovation? Ask them questions during your interview process. If I ask the question, what do you think is the best innovation out there right now in the food industry? And even by that response, I'm able to ascertain whether or not they have that growth mindset that will really support me in my job.
I think that's fantastic advice. And so the follow-up to that then is, if the innovator is most important, what makes a good innovator?
I really do think it's your traveler mindset. I think you have to have passion, conviction, tenacity, because it's not going to be an easy road. You have to want that challenge because you can't just phone it in every day at your job. I really do think you got to be a good listener. And to be honest with you, that's important. Now, I think it's the number one leadership quality as well, is the empathy and the listening. I think they go hand in hand. But having that empathy for what you're trying to do, empathy for the consumer that you're trying to create for, empathy for what the company's goals are, and making sure those all align. You got to develop a thick skin. You were talking about the white male presence. It's out there. I'm certainly not going to bash all the white males out there. I've actually had some really great leaders that have been white males. So it's less to me. I mean, yes, you're always going to have the gender issue as a woman, as I have throughout my entire career, but it's really the person you're dealing with, or the people that you're dealing with, and are they making the decisions, and do they believe in you?
I think that's so. As you've done a great job explaining the innovator versus the idea, the skills of an innovator. But we all know that innovation is not the lone genius fallacy, right? It's not Thomas Edison locked in a lab, or Elon Musk locked wherever he's locked up. It takes a village. It takes a team. Mm-hmm. And so I think the last question I want to ask you in terms of this piece is, how does an innovator then become a manager or leader of a team of innovators? What's that secret sauce?
They're inextricably linked for me in terms of being a good leader and whether or not you're a leader of innovation or something else. To me, I always walk into situations where I want the people on my team to feel motivated, and that means they need passion projects. I'm not going to be, as the senior leader on the team, taking all the strategy work and they get to do the scut work. That's not fair. I don't believe in that. It's not even just building a big bench. I just want them to learn. So I believe everybody should have some passion project. We're all going to do scut work, budget parts. The budget is not very fun to manage. So we all take turns doing that. So I think giving them the opportunity to perform and the chance to prove themselves. I think learning how to step back and not take control, but let them learn from their own mistakes, guide them. Patience is really important too. When I am interviewing people for my team, what I look for is somebody who's both linear and a lateral thinker. And to me, you need both. So we've been talking a lot here about analog reasoning and blue skying and doing affinity sorting with all these different ideas. That's really important. You have to have that mindset. But when it comes down to it, you're still commercializing something at the end of the day. And there are 110 plus steps to commercialize a food product. You're working cross-functionally with your regulatory team. You're working with your finance team. You're working with your sales team. You're working there. You have to be very good at cross-functional team leadership and team management. And you also need to know when you can switch back and forth between linear thinking and lateral thinking throughout the day.
That's a great framework to remember, linear versus lateral. I'd like to just kind of wrap up by asking you a question that I think is very important, as what about innovation or anything else we've talked about that you think would be important for people to hear that maybe I haven't asked?
It's easy to rest on your laurels at a company and just keep selling what you're currently selling. But I truly believe if you're not innovating, you will die as a company. And from a food specific perspective, we will die sometimes as a culture. Like I'm very much into sustainable food sources as well, and all the work that is going into regenerative agriculture and and pushing the boundaries that way. So there's a lot of innovation that, hey, that's new and cool and a new flavor, but there's also some really important innovation going on out there. And I wouldn't always say it's coming from me as an innovator. I'm not a food scientist, but all of the engineers out there that are creating things that are going to make life easier, better for me, for the consumer, for the world, for the planet, to me is what drives me. It's beyond the profits itself. But if we want to leave a world for our kids that are going to make a difference and have them live in a world that at least I'd like to see for my kids, you need to innovate. Otherwise, we will die as a culture.
I think it's a wonderful place to end. So, Beth, I want to say thank you for taking the time to share everything you have.
Thank you. It was nice being here today. Thank you for having me.